Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. This time, we're going to start by taking a closer look at the sword Simon passed on to us from Ludwig. Holy Sword of Moonlight, sword of holy mystery that Ludwig once discovered. When it puts on the blue light of the moon and harbors the abyss of outer space, the great blade is made to cascade forth a dark light wave. It is the weapon which symbolizes Ludwig the Holy Blade, but those who have actually set eyes on the great blade are few. That was his exclusive, secretly concealed guidance. And since we have the advantage of being able to play the game in order to get a sense for what that somewhat abstract description is meant to convey, allow me to provide a visual demonstration. In its standard form, it has the look of a large but otherwise mundane sword, and it can be used as such. When transformed, though, it takes on an entirely new aspect. In this state, it can indeed fire projectiles that might be described as light waves. This is important to understand because all of the visual information is thematically relevant to the weapon, though both these themes and the depiction of the Great Blade itself are complicated by the variety of meanings contained by the Japanese word for blue. For instance, on a purely descriptive level, if you looked at the light cast by the sword and found it more green or maybe teal as opposed to a true blue, well, that's considerably less of an issue in Japanese, since the word aoi can be used to describe a wider range of the blue-green color band than blue does in English. It is for this reason that you can find references to aoringo, literally blue rather than green apples, in Japan. Also, since the word for the color that means go on a traffic light is officially ao in Japan, the signal will often appear turquoise or teal in addition to a more typical green. Bloodborne may not have traffic lights, but the result of this wider understanding of what counts as blue is that on a basic descriptive level, the word aoi is a more accurate term for the color of the Holy Moonlight Sword's magic blade than the official English. However, there's good reason why even if the translators could see how the sword looked in the game, the official English should still use the word blue. That's because the color term isn't simply being applied to the weapon itself, but rather being used as a modifier describing the light of the moon. In English, green, teal, or turquoise moonlight is going to sound strange, whereas blue moonlight is an existing phrase. This makes the color blue a more attractive option than anything closer to green, but unfortunately it doesn't help much with another meaning of the term aoi that's potentially relevant to Bloodborne. That would be the word's association with paleness. Remember that in the original, pale blood is written as aozameta chi, which could literally be understood as blood that's gone blue. So the description for the Holy Moonlight Sword may not be referring to a color at all, but rather saying that the sword can take on the pale light of the moon. What really makes this tricky, though, is that the Japanese term can remain ambiguous, whereas in English you have to go with one idea or the other. Even if you add the descriptor pale, so you get pale blue moonlight, it would be too easy for players to interpret this as a reference to a light blue color. That raises the question of which meaning the translators should go with, and for reasons that get back to the thematic visuals of this weapon, I think emphasizing the color blue was the right choice. As we've seen, the Japanese term aoi is used to describe the moonlight that the sword can be clad in, so in a sense, the color that we see rising from the blade symbolizes the moon. But there's another color, or more accurately, shade, that's part of the light wave's description. The Japanese phrasing also refers to uchu no shin-en, where uchu means outer space, and shin-en means abyss. Now, that latter term gets thrown around a lot in FromSoft games, and at least in my own experience, it's easy to think of more abstractly than it necessarily needs to be. In this instance, however, the fact that an abyss can just be a bottomless chasm seems particularly relevant, because thinking about it that way makes it easier to see that literally, the sword is being said to harbor the endless gulf of outer space. So, as we saw in that visual demonstration, the darkness or shadow contained within the light waves is black, while the magic light of the sword is somewhere in the blue-green spectrum. This gives us two different colors, one that represents the light of the moon, and another that depicts the void of space. It's an interplay between light and darkness given a cosmic theme, and I think that works better with the concept of blue rather than pale moonlight. So even if the official translation of blue doesn't cover the same broad set of meanings as the Japanese aoi, I do think the term conveys the most important aspects of the original. If anything, my concern with this part of the description would be that abyssal cosmos is perhaps too obscure. It also flips the phrase uchu no shinen around, so that rather than have the word for cosmos modify abyss, the adjective abyssal is being used to describe the term cosmos. Cosmic abyss would be closer to the Japanese wording. Still, the core mechanical information about the sword comes through, the theming around the moon and outer space is there, and it sounds natural enough, so all things considered, this is a pretty small nitpick. But this description does more than just help the sword's mechanics fit the world of Bloodborne. It also furthers the ongoing question of Ludwig's madness, and here I think the official translation really shines. Note, for instance, the addition of the term whatever to the start of the phrase whatever guidance it has to offer, which further throws doubt on its existence. Also, consider how carefully the English description matches the Japanese use of the phrase great blade to potentially separate the physical form of the sword from its arcane cutting edge. The result is an elegant recreation of the core ideas of the Japanese, leaving players uncertain of Ludwig's sanity. If only this next item turned out as well. Eye Pendant. An eye pendant which becomes the key to the surgery altar. In the Hunter's Nightmare, there are 2 grand cathedrals, and beyond the River of Blood, in the second grand cathedral, is said to be the experimental ward that the healing church once kept secret. The only ones who can enter there are chosen medical practitioners who possess eyes, or the poor patients. Bestow the eye unto the skull on the surgery altar. That is a strong ending, but unfortunately there are 2 major discrepancies between the Japanese and the official English earlier on, with the first of these actually being in the interesting position of being discernible by players who don't speak Japanese. That's because the in-game context makes it obvious that the landscape being described can only be found in the Hunter's Nightmare, not the Hunter's Dream as the official wording states. Anyway, there are 2 reasons why I find this interesting. First, while it's clearly less than ideal for the English description to name the wrong place, the error is so recognizable that I doubt it's ever seriously misled players. I cannot imagine someone reading this and then frantically searching for a hidden path to 2 cathedrals and a river of blood in the Hunter's Dream. Instead, if players notice this issue at all, I think they'd simply recognize that the location should be the Hunter's Nightmare, and at most maybe wonder if the same error was made in the Japanese. As we've seen, the answer to that question is no, but this brings me to the second interesting thing about this mistake, because while the Japanese does refer to Karyudo no Akumu, or the Hunter's Nightmare, that same term has been used for the Hunter's Dream in the past. As I mentioned most recently in Translationborne 68, the Japanese text has more than one reference to the Hunter's Dream as a nightmare, including a note where it is literally called Karyudo no Akumu. That particular phrasing was rendered "this dreadful hunter's dream" in English, which makes me suspect that the precedent for translating Karyudo no Akumu as hunter's dream is what led to this mix-up in the description. I say that because it makes me think of how a lot of game translation is done using software that recognizes set terms and phrases in the Japanese and provides quick access to their English equivalents. This is generally helpful, but I can easily imagine a case where the first hit for Karyudo no Akumu was Hunter's Dream, probably followed by Hunter's Nightmare, and then all it would take is a simple misclick to wind up with the wrong term. Ironically, this means it's possible that the translator's decision to favor clarity when referring to the Hunter's Dream may have been what caused this confusion. Whatever the reason for that error, though, it's ultimately much less confusing than the other discrepancy between the official English and Japanese texts. What makes this particularly tricky is that both versions sort of work, though once again, the difficulty stems at least in part from the treatment of a game-specific term. That would be the Japanese word daiseido, and if you look it up in a dictionary, you'll see that it means cathedral, just like it's been translated here. What you won't see is that practically everywhere else in the game, daiseido refers to the grand or great cathedral of the healing church. By this understanding, it's not cathedrals in general, but the healing church's grand cathedral that the Eye Pendant is saying the Hunter's Nightmare has 2 of. The Japanese doesn't call out the location of the first one, but it does state that the second Grand Cathedral, which is modified by the phrase, past the River of Blood, is the location of the research hall. Presumably then, the first Grand Cathedral is the one where we took the Eye Pendant from the flaming cleric beast. But remember how the official English uses the more generic term cathedral? Well, this allows the translators to locate the first religious structure past the River of Blood and have it make sense, because the Nightmare Church could be understood as a cathedral. Then the second location is once again identified as containing the research hall of the Healing Church. So both versions of this description mention two religious buildings and indicate that the second contains a hall for medical experimentation, but the actual details implied by each language are very different. Unlike the previous issue, I don't have a theory about what would have caused this discrepancy, but one huge consideration to keep in mind is that the translators almost certainly wouldn't have been able to play the DLC to figure out exactly what the Japanese description was referencing. Also, if anyone did go over the English version while playing the game, like a localization QA team, the fact that the description ultimately points players in the right direction would have made it hard to identify as a mistake. Finally, we have to remember that it's entirely possible that the current Japanese text received an update that the English did not, as we've seen that several times before. If that's the case though, we can at least be glad that unlike the North American version of the gold pendant, the most important directions for using this item are clear. It lets players know that it functions as a key, allowing passage to the research hall from the second cathedral by granting eyes to the skull of the surgery altar, which is what we're going to do in the next episode. Before we get there though, there's one last thing I want to point out about this item. You probably caught how the final line shifts from a direct reference to the Eye Pendant to the more symbolic act of granting eyes to a skull. This same move takes place in the Japanese, though notably it happens sooner. You may have noticed that in my literal version I described the medical practitioners capable of entering the research hall as possessing eyes. This is almost certainly another double meaning, meant to indicate both that they had Eye Pendant keys and that they had a great deal of insight. Now, in this instance, I think the official translation prioritizing the practical information before making the same metaphorical shift in the next line is a perfectly reasonable choice. Still, I wanted to mention that slight difference before moving on to this next dialogue, or rather, this next mantra.
Shrouded by night but with steady stride, coloured by blood but always clear of mind, proud unto the church. Beasts are a curse and a curse is a shackle. Only ye are the true blades of the church.
Thankfully, unlike the directions on the Eye Pendant, I find the translation of these lines to be incredibly well done. This is no mean feat either, because as we've seen with some of the other religious phrases and prayers throughout the game, one of the biggest challenges in rendering this type of speech into English is putting the language into the appropriate form. So let's start by identifying some of the general features of the Japanese and seeing what's important to convey to players in English. Right from the first line, we can see a noticeably archaic speech pattern with the use of arite instead of the modern atte, with the final naran probably also being an example of the archaic mu form that I discussed back in Translationborne 23. The individual phrases are also quite short, and they end up following a repeating pattern. First, there's a set of two lines that are similar in structure, then there's a follow-up line invoking the identity of a church hunter. Purely from this structure, it seems obvious that this is meant to be a creed or mantra repeated aloud by church hunters to keep them grounded and give them an ideal to aim for. All of this, I would argue, carries over to the English. It's a little harder to spot the archaic language in translation, since this only comes out with the use of ye towards the end, but the pattern of the phrases matches well enough that it's still immediately clear that this isn't regular speech. In particular, I like how the official translation breaks out the two statements that compose the first Japanese line, so each one stands on its own. This allows the translators to make the repeated pattern more noticeable by first listing an external condition that could affect a church hunter using the word by, then using the word but to conclude with a statement about how the inner state of that hunter should remain unaffected. I suspect it was to fit this format that the wording sometimes strays so far from the literal, but I think enough of the meaning gets through that it's worth the extra emphasis on structure. Shrouded by night is obviously close to in the night, and while colored by blood is a little unclear, I think the ambiguity fits Bloodborne's themes better than the more straightforward covered in blood, as the latter may even apply to my corpse. I also think it better sets up the subsequent clear of mind, because it's easier to imagine a hunter's judgment being affected if they're colored by blood than if they simply have blood on their clothes. With steady stride is probably the biggest leap the official translation makes, but while this doesn't reflect the literal meaning of mayo in terms of getting lost, it does convey the related ideas of not hesitating and moving with purpose. This helps paint a picture of how an ideal church hunter is supposed to behave, just like in the Japanese. And when you add to that the way the overall structure of the lines helps convey the nature of this dialogue in English, I find the final result impressive. Having said that though, there is one element of the Japanese that's harder to pick up on in English, and it involves the meaning of the term that's been translated as shackle. The kanji involved is a rare one, and while the word that it's being used to portray can mean constraint or oppression, this particular character has a strong association with the word yoke. Now, I don't think this is meant to be taken very literally. After all, a yoke is used to tie two animals together for the purpose of accomplishing farm work, and I don't think the Healing Church is interested in agricultural techniques. Even in a metaphorical sense, I doubt they think of curses as serving a higher purpose. What I find more likely is the idea that in calling a curse a yoke, the Japanese is implying that rather than serving merely as constraints, curses bind things together. Perhaps the thought is that beasts and beasthood tie humans to this plane, preventing the ascension to a higher state of being that the Healing Church is aiming for. Also, if we think of the statement that curses bind things together more widely, then we can see it in other aspects of the game as well. For instance, remember how when we first came to the Hunter's Nightmare, we heard her voice laying a curse on people? This could potentially explain the nature of that curse, since its effect is that hunters who go drunk with blood have their spirits confined to an eternal hunt. The idea would be that the curse is what binds them to the nightmare, because part of the nature of curses is to tie things together. That's all speculative, of course, but I do think the concept of a yoke brings this out better than that of a shackle. Despite the different nuance of the English term, though, I do think the translators have done about as good a job as possible considering the circumstances. For one thing, beasts are a curse and a curse is a yoke just sounds weird. And for another, it's not like shackles can't be used to bind people to other things, like in the phrase shackled to a post. Also, in terms of wider applications, the English word makes more sense of how our health is reduced in a cursed dungeon. And while the Japanese is different, in English, Gehrman cries out in his sleep about wanting to be unshackled from the hunter's dream, which also gets at the tie to a nightmare. So ultimately, I think going with shackle was the right choice, but I wanted to note the extra nuance of the word yoke before ending the episode. Now that I've done that, let me conclude by reminding you to expect the Translationborne index linked below to be updated within 24 hours. Also, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, please let me know. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.